I'm in Louisville, and we just got our first snow today. So, we got maybe a quarter of an inch, and schools are out. Hey everyone, welcome to the first podcast for 2017. We closed out December with a record number of downloads. We were at 31,000 for the month. Super excited about that, and that actually put us at an all-time downloads of reaching near 200,000. It's actually just incredible, so thank you everyone for your support, and thank you for listening. It almost feels like we're just getting started, and we've got lots of great guests, and probably going to get some returning guests coming on as well. We're going to take the podcast, I think, in probably a little bit different direction in 2017. We've looked at the data and see what people are really interested in hearing about. The types of guests and the content might be a little bit different than what we were used to, but it's still going to be entertaining as hell. Once again, thank you to everyone who supports the show. If you haven't supported yet, please consider doing so. Visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit, to learn more about all the cool swag such as t-shirts and koozies you get in return. Enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit podcast. So it's just Kenny here today, and it's actually a snowy day here in Louisville. This is a week where it's our first snow, and we were kind of joking before we started recording that we just got our first quarter inch, and all the schools are closed around here. It's the way that people from the Northeast and everywhere else they always laugh at us because Louisville just doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to take care of snow. But it is during the time of the year when, the barrels are starting to do their contraction. They're starting to do all the things that you hear about when you go and you visit things on the Bourbon Trail. And so this is really how the magic is happening, right? We have those shifts in the weather, and this is how the sausage is made, I guess is a good way to put it. So today on the show, we have a legendary author. We have Chuck Cowdery on the show. So today, Chuck, welcome, first off.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, good. So before we jump into it, I think it's notable. We have to say that, you are one of the legends when it comes to being a bourbon author. You've written all kinds of books such as Bourbon Straight, Bourbon Strange. And I kind of want to give people an understanding of first a little bit about you. Talk about the man before bourbon and kind of how you got into it as well.
Well, I probably the biggest thing was my moving to Louisville back in the very snowy year of 1978. I moved there in the late winter of 1978, and there was a foot of snow on the ground. That may be hard to believe, but that was a very, very snowing winter in Louisville. And just I came there from Ohio, and really, even that long ago, there were more distilleries, more companies. Everybody was based in Louisville. I was in the advertising business, and the nature of small local ad agencies in those days was you had, everybody had one local bank and one local bakery. And as things started to get more national, that was less and less of the case. But in Louisville, everybody had a distillery. Every ad agency had one of the distillers or one of the marketing companies as a client. So actually, one of the very first people I met in the industry in Louisville was Max Shapiro, the president of Heaven Hill. And the agency I worked for had Heaven Hill as an account. And I didn't really directly work on the account because I did mostly the radio and TV advertising for the agency, but Max is a big presence, and when he was in the office, everybody knew it. It wasn't a very big office, so I've known Max, since those days. So that was my first exposure to the industry, and then I went to work for another company in Louisville where I worked with Brown-Forman and worked on a lot of their brands. Although in those days, didn't do much on any of the bourbon brands because bourbon was pretty much dead in the late 70s, early 80s. We would talk about doing something for, say, Early Times or Forrester, and then the answer we would get back would be, we're just trying to keep those brands alive and keep them profitable. And we're not investing a lot in them because people are just not buying them. And there was a lot of feeling at that time that maybe bourbon was going to go the way of some other beverages that had kind of died out and maybe just held on with a small market. But, nobody really foresaw that the business had been down for about 20 years, 15 years at that point, and people were beginning to come to the conclusion that it wasn't going to come back. So at any rate, that was my exposure to the industry. And then actually, after I moved to Chicago, Kentucky was getting ready to celebrate its bicentennial of statehood. That would have been in 1970 or 1992. Kentucky became a state in 1792. And the KET was giving out some money for people to do productions about Kentucky subjects. I put in a proposal to do a documentary about bourbon, and also got the Kentucky Distillers Association to chip in some money. And so I worked on that in 91 and 92. And that was first broadcast in June of 1992. And I think it's still being broadcast on KET every once in a while. And that was called Made and Bottled in Kentucky. And that was really the first thing I did. And after that, I just stayed interested in it. I found that almost everything that had been written about American whiskey was written sort of as a follow-on to something that was being written about Scotch. Somebody would sit down and write a book or write an article or write a chapter in a book about whiskey, and they would primarily write about Scotch, and then at the end of it, they would throw in a little bit about bourbon, and almost everything you read about bourbon was sort of predicated on how it's different from Scotch. But very few people, nobody really, was writing just about bourbon. So I got interested and started doing a little bit of that, and wrote a few articles for a very, very early version of what was then called Malt Advocate and is now called Whiskey Advocate. And I also started publishing my own newsletter, the Bourbon Country Reader, which I still publish and is still very kind of small, no advertising, so on and so forth. And then, a few years after that, did the first book, and then did the book, the A.H. Hirsch book, the Best Bourbon You'll Never Taste. That came along in 2012, and then Bourbon Strange came along in 2014. So that's pretty much the story.
Well, I think you kind of created your own little white whale hunt when you named a book "The Best Bourbon You'll Never Taste."
Yeah, I'm an old ad guy. I mean, that's my background is advertising. So I do think in terms of the provocative headline, the sort of thing that will, that's what a headline's supposed to do. It's supposed to make you want to read further. And yeah, I've gotten a lot of notes from people who say they've tasted it or they went on a pursuit to find it and managed to obtain a bottle. Part of my motivation in writing that book, which actually, interestingly enough, started out as what I thought was going to just be a blog post. And I'm like a lot of writers. I think that's how I process information. If I've got some information that I want to kind of get straight in my own head, my process is to start writing about it. And that was really how that book started. And as I just kept going, it got longer and longer, and certainly got too long to be a blog post. I thought, I think there may be a book in this. And and I had written about the subject for the newsletter and so forth in the past too. So I had sort of the beginnings of some material on it. And but part of my motivation in actually writing and publishing the book was I knew there were lots of people who had really cases of the stuff that they had bought and had it in their closet or their basement or whatever. And, as you well know, selling alcohol is problematic legally, but people do it, and I knew that people would do it, and I kind of wanted to liberate to the best that I could those bottles that were sitting in people's closets and basements and so forth, and give people the idea that, hey, there really is some demand for this out there. If you can see your way clear to, maybe bend some laws a little bit, there's a market for it, and you'll be doing the greater bourbon loving world a favor by letting people actually drink the stuff and not just admiring the bottles on your shelf or wherever you have them. And I think that did prompt a lot of people to, and the internet, where people are able to get information about all sorts of things, including bourbon and what's available, I think did prompt a lot of people to feel like this was the time for them to cash in on that acquisition. And so I think a lot of people did, and you still hear about people. Actually, right around the time, and I write about this in the book, right about the time I was writing the book, right about the time I was finishing it, I got a note from somebody who had actually found a bottle of the A.H. Hirsch on a shelf in, I think, on the south side of Louisville, if I remember correctly, Fern Valley or someplace like that, Prospect, not Prospect, but one of the southern suburbs. And, found it on the shelf at the original shelf price, which at that point had been like $80 a bottle at the time when people were paying over $1,000 a bottle for it, which is about what people are paying for it now. Anyway, that was sort of the story of that book, and it's been surprisingly successful as a book. It's now that was now almost
Back in 2012, right? So yeah, it's been a little bit,
and it's still selling, which kind of surprised me. It actually sold very well over Christmas, and I don't know if people who managed to get a hold of bottles were trying. I certainly know a lot of people who either before or after buying a bottle also bought the book because they wanted sort of to know the story of and there's really nowhere else where that story has been fully worked out. A lot of people call me a historian. I don't call myself that. I think I'm a writer, a history writer, a popularizer, but most of the history I write is stuff that where other people did the real hard legwork. I'm just sort of writing it up as a story and making it available to people. With the Hirsch, I actually did some real historic sleuthing in terms of talking to original people who'd been involved with it, including Julian Van Winkle. And Mr. Hirsch himself is long since gone, but talked to some of the other people who'd been involved with it. Henry Price, for example, who owned the brand at one time, and so I was able to get and Dick Stoltz, who was the last master distiller at Michter's, and talked to him about it. He remembered it, and so that was interesting for me. And then I think it also made the book interesting. It's not a real big book, but it's got a lot of information that you can't find anywhere else if you're interested in. And it's not just that product, but how that sort of phenomenon comes about.
Absolutely. So I think give the listeners just a little bit more information about Bourbon Straight and Bourbon Strange. Just kind of a quick 1 minute overview of what each one kind of offers, in case they feel like going on a Amazon shopping spree.
Yeah, they're both available on Amazon. All three of them are available on Amazon, as is the documentary Made and Bottled in Kentucky. Bourbon Straight, again, has been sort of a phenomenon. I've been real happy with the fact it still sells very well, and it came out in 2004, so it's more than 10 years old, and still sells very, very well. And it's kind of the I certainly don't discourage anybody from buying it. It's the bourbon industry changes pretty slowly, so even though there certainly have been changes in that period of time, a lot of it's still very, very valid, and certainly the things about how bourbon is made and so forth. None of that's changed. So it's pretty much an overview. It's not a lot. It includes about 35 reviews of specific products, and there are certainly tasting notes in there, but tasting notes and that sort of thing is not really my thing. I think of myself as a good explainer. That's what I've always been in my life, is good at explaining things, and that's sort of what I based my straight career on too. And that's what I try to do. Try to make a lot of this stuff clear and try to cut through a lot of the marketing stuff. The marketing is like marketing for bourbon is like marketing for anything else. I mean, they're trying to sell a product. They're trying to make it look as appealing as possible. I try to cut through some of the stuff that is maybe a little misleading and make it a little clearer to people. And the second book in that sort of series, Bourbon Strange, which just came out in 2014, is really just continuing that. I mean, I went even more into sort of storytelling in terms of specific stories about how things happened and history to some extent, although a lot of the more recent history, and certainly covering the history of the boom that perhaps started in 2000, 2001, and really got underway a few years after that. Covers a lot of that, and I get a lot of positive feedback that says it's very readable, very easy to read and enjoyable to read, and that's important to me. I wasn't trying to create a encyclopedia. I wasn't trying to create a reference book. I was trying to create something that you could sit down and read and enjoy.
Well, good. So let's go ahead and just jump into to today's news and some of the blog articles you've written, because it seems like that's where you're publishing a lot of stuff. So the biggest topic to kind of really talk about, on episode 78 of the fourth edition of the Bourbon Community Roundtable that we host on the podcast, we went in depth talking about the price increase that we saw with Booker's, and the whole nation went on a scare hunt. It was something that came out from Beam Suntory that said the new suggested retail price is going to be $99.99. And from there, it started a huge panic, I guess you could say, in the bourbon world. Everybody was talking about it. And as of this week, there was some real interesting news that came out that Beam is almost kind of reversing their decision. And I'm going to kind of go ahead and let you kind of talk a little bit more about what the decision was, where it's going to be, and kind of your thoughts about it, because I liked how you started off your blog post and I guess you can say the way that you would capture this. The first word just says dumb with a period.
Yeah, I mean, that's a conclusion to a whole process that went on. The way it all started, I don't know, a month or so ago, was there started to be some rumors, some of the websites, some of the Facebook pages and stuff, people were saying, oh, their rep said, they heard from their Beam rep, or the store reported to them that their Beam rep had told them that this price increase was coming. And my reply at the time was, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems like that would be a bad move on their part. A lot of people, I think, when it was confirmed, maybe a week or so later, and I got a call from my sources at Beam, and as did Fred Minnick and Mark Gillespie and other people in the business, saying, no, actually it's true. That is our plan, and they gave us some details. And in fact, a lot of people jumped on me, I think unfairly, saying that I had been misleading them with my earlier comments. But my earlier comments, I didn't have any information and didn't present it as though I had. I just said, to me, it doesn't seem like a very smart move, and therefore I doubt that it's true. And then it turned out to be true, and I was accused of lying and so forth. And I mean, people get kind of crazy about this stuff. And then just 2 days ago, Beam called as far as I know, only two people, and I was not one of them. They contacted Mark and they contacted Fred. I think maybe they anticipated what my reaction would be and didn't want to, didn't want to. And again, the people who would be calling me aren't the people who made the decision. I'm pretty confident. But yeah, I mean, I think it was dumb. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that what they were trying to do, raising the price, trying to change the positioning a little bit, trying to push Booker's more into the unicorn status. I don't know that that was necessarily a bad idea. I think they just went about it very badly. And I also think that it's really a question if you can really fabricate something like that, whether or not you can just decide, oh, we're going to make this product so desirable that we can get a lot more money for it. I don't know that you can necessarily just do that by declaration, by fiat. And in fact, what happened proved that you couldn't. But what they basically did was they backpedaled, not entirely, but it was they said they were going to increase the price more gradually, and that the new wholesale price would support a retail price more in the vicinity of $65-$75 as opposed to $100. But that's still about a rather than 100% increase over the current price, it's about a 50% increase. Plus, Beam has always been a very deal-driven company. You see Beam products on sale a lot because they offer them to the wholesale trade on sale with great regularity. So you can almost always find a deal somewhere on your Beam white label, less frequently, but still fairly often on Knob Creek and some of their other brands. And so, as everybody was commenting, Booker's routinely around the country, depending on where you're talking about, you might find it for as little as $35 a bottle, even though the suggested retail is like 50. You frequently find it in the 40s. And it's one of those products you almost never see retailers marking up like they do with, say, the Van Winkles or the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, where retailers themselves will take an increase over the suggested retail. And that's not legal in every state, but it's legal in many of them, and that's what they do. Booker's has never really even been able to do that. So I think what happened, nobody's given me any direct information, but what I believe happened was that they got serious pushback from the trade, people in the trade saying, I know of some people who actually returned orders, basically saying that this is going to kill the brand. We don't want this on our shelves at that price because nobody's going to pay it. And I think when they start getting that kind of feedback, that's the kind of thing that the company has to listen to. So I'm sure nobody wanted to reverse this. It's obviously very embarrassing. I mean, there's no way to spin it where they don't have substantial egg on their faces. It's an embarrassing thing to do. You don't even see it that often from companies because it's so much to be avoided. And it does seem, maybe they were all distracted by their big headquarters move. They just moved their headquarters from Deerfield, a suburb of Chicago, down into the Merchandise Mart, which is right just outside the Loop in area of Chicago called River North, just north of the Chicago River. And so they moved back into the city where they had been until the 80s, and maybe they were distracted by everybody. Maybe they lost some papers along the way, but it seems like maybe they lost some brain cells because it was a really bonehead move. I mean, they didn't research it well enough or think it through well enough before they did the thing originally to anticipate this kind of a reaction, which I think they could have anticipated if they had their heads screwed on straight.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to give some credit to the people that were making up a lot of the theories, right? Even in the last roundtable, Blake and Carrie from Bourboner and Suburbia.com kind of said, like, this could be just a huge marketing scheme, or it could be something that fourth quarter sales were down, and this is a way to really ramp them up towards the end of the year. And
I think they wish they were that smart.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was funny that, at the very end, Carrie said that we have power as the consumer. And you kind of talked about people in the industry, the salespeople that said, oh, they're getting the pushback. Whereas there was a good survey that came out from Breaking Bourbon that said over 89% of the respondents said that they would never buy Booker's at that sort of suggested retail price. So I don't really know if they were actually listening to the consumers or if they were listening more to the people that are in the industry that were really pushing them back. But I think by and large, I don't think there was more than a handful of people that were actually in support of it.
Well, the nature of the industry is that, they listen to consumers, but it's a very structured industry by law. The fact that the producers can only sell to licensed distributors and the retailers can only buy from licensed distributors, and the consumer can only buy from licensed retailers. So yes, consumer feedback is very important, but mostly it's the consumer feedback that comes through the channel, that comes, people complaining to the retailer complains to the wholesaler complains to Beam Suntory, and that's really how. So I don't mean to suggest that the consumer pushback was not important. Obviously, it was the driver of the whole pushback. But the way Beam receives that pushback is through the trade channels. And so the retailers are hearing from the consumers and the wholesalers are hearing from the retailers. And that's how the information is transmitted. And it's much more powerful that way. If you complain to your retailer about anything, that's really much more powerful than complaining directly to Beam. Because that's what, the people who are actually making the orders that put the money in their pockets are the wholesalers who are getting their orders from the retailers. And that's really what drives that decision making. And I'm sure that the folks at Beam were loath to reverse this. I mean, it's terribly embarrassing. So it had to have been very, very strong feedback that told them this isn't going to work. And I mean, people do. Yeah, I read a lot of comments. Oh, I'll never buy Booker's again. I'll never buy a Beam product again. People say a lot of things,
right?
And there's a much better way to measure something like that, and that's by how much is sold. And you said at the very beginning of this thing, there are constantly new people coming into this enthusiasm who don't know the history. And one of the people who commented on my blog said, that they had talked to people, and they said very few people know about all the tumult that goes on in the chat groups and in the various groups of hardcore enthusiasts. And I think that's true, but what that also neglects is that the reason the producers care about the hardcore enthusiasts is because they're powerful influencers. The guy in any group who is that group's expert, on whiskey or vodka or whatever else it might be, sausages, I mean, whatever it might be, the guy who's the expert in any group of friends is listened to and is an influencer. And that's what they call it in the marketing business, is influencers. And that's where I think a lot of this happens. So no, the average person who goes into a store and buys a bottle of Jim Beam or Maker's Mark or even Booker's is not necessarily a person who knows all of this backstory and history and news and all the rest of it. But, they heard something from a friend, they heard something from a buddy, a father or a son or whatever, and that may not even register in their mind why they don't like Booker's anymore. And of course, the price itself speaks to people. I think a lot of stores, because this is a normal thing to do in retail, saw the new pricing coming down in terms of what they would be paying and immediately marked up their shelf stock. And some people blew it out, but I think other people immediately took the price increase and probably were surprised to see the product just sit there, that nobody was buying it at the higher price. And then that's why they stopped ordering more and so forth. The kinds of messages that signal the mistake to the producer. But they're still cutting the production. They're still not going to produce as much Bookers. So Bookers is going to be more scarce.
I guess that's another question to kind of pose to you as well, because that's one of the things that came out. They said they're going from 6 batches a year down to 4 batches. And a lot of people are calling bullshit, because it's like you have the stock. Like what's the point of doing that?
Well, they don't necessarily have the stock in that, they were actually doing 6. And in some years, I think in the last year, they actually did 7 batches. And they were probably really pushing the stock to its limits. When we do the Booker's Roundtable that I've been involved with, not every single time, but in a lot of them, we get a real insight into how the product is produced, and they select batches of barrels from a couple of different warehouses, a couple of different warehouse locations, a couple of different ages, and everything. Their sort of limit is 6 years old. They won't go any younger than 6 years old. And it's usually a mix of 6 to 8 year old whiskey. I think they found themselves pushing closer and closer to that 6 year old in order to find enough suitable barrels to push out with the demand that they were getting. And so I think they did finally say, well, rather than continuing to increase the products that get the whiskey that gets to that age and has the other characteristics that they look for in Bookers, we're going to put a limit on it. We're only going to, maybe because all of their products are growing, and that same juice, that same liquid is in Jim Beam. It's in Jim Beam's signature products. It's in and they have a 12-year-old now in the Jim Beam signature line. Not a huge product at this point, but that supply has to come from somewhere, and it's the same stock as what becomes Booker's. Knob Creek the same way. Knob Creek's a much bigger brand in terms of volume sales, and it's also been growing, and it's been harder and harder for them to support that brand, to the point that they've taken the age statement off of it. And so there have been changes there as well. And I think more modest price increases. Yeah, I think what they probably should have done, if in retrospect, is go ahead with the limitation, the reduction in production, and then let the price seek its own level. If they found that they were just selling it out instantly with each release, there was that much demand for it, then they could have easily raised the price and done it maybe 20% a quarter or something like that. And that's essentially what they've said now that they're going to do. Although they're going to take a pretty hefty price increase right off the bat, and they may wind up suppressing demand in the short term. And that may not be a bad thing either, because they do want to, they want to have some scarcity, but they don't want to have too much scarcity. They certainly, the risk with any product that is scarce is that people will just get bored with trying to find it and look to other things. And how many people do you know who don't even bother to try to find a Van Winkle?
Lots of people. Yeah.
Because it's just too much trouble. It's just too much money. Once you've satisfied your curiosity and somebody has shared a drink with you, the pursuit is just not that edifying. Buffalo Trace Antique Collection is kind of in the same vein. Very hard to get. Bottles never see the shelf. So it's along the same line. At Booker's, I think they probably have mixed feelings. I don't think they want to get to a point where the stuff never appears on the shelf. The other thing I think that drove this was, or they should have been looking at, was I don't think Booker's does a lot of action on the secondary market. Secondary market's very hard to gauge. You can get a lot of opinions, but very few are well informed because it's also underground. But the Booker's has not been a big actor in the secondary market. There have been a few of the special editions. The 25th anniversary, certainly the Booker's Rye was something that had a lot of action in the secondary market. But even there, you didn't see a lot of people selling it for much more than the original price, where people might have bought a bottle for $300 and sold it for $350 or $400, but not for $700, $800, $900, the kind of markups that you get on the Van Winkles. And so I think they could have seen that. They could have looked at that and said, I don't know if Booker's is ready to support the higher price. But anyway, it's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people look at it and do reach some kind of preposterous conclusions. But at the same time, I thought the original rumor was preposterous, and it turned out not to be. So you can never be too sure about. Certainly not. 2016 has been was a year when a lot of unexpected things happened. A lot of things happened that people didn't think would ever happen.
For sure. And I think they always say there's no such thing as bad publicity. And I think when you think about what they did, is even for a modest enthusiast, somebody who's just a very novice into it, and they read about it, and they're not in the, they don't have large collections or anything like that, but they read about that. And then the first thing they think is, well, I need to just go where I can get a bottle. And so it definitely put the word Booker's in the minds of a lot of those people that are just starting to get into the hobby as well. So it did have another effect on those sorts of people at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the adage, there's no publicity. I think sometimes there is. I don't think in the long run, I don't think anybody at Beam would say they wanted this to happen. And I think in the long run, it's not good for the brand. But people's memories are short. And as we've pointed out, new people coming in are not going to know this history. And they're going to go into a store and they're going to hear that Booker's is good, and they're going to see it being at whatever price it is. And there are certainly other bourbons that are priced similarly. So, and certainly $100 isn't an obstacle for a lot of people, especially people who are coming over from Scotch, for example, and are used to paying that and much, much more for a bottle. And I think that, again, these people are in business. They're in business to make a profit, and they're in business to increase that profit. And when you think about the whiskey business, you've got whiskey in barrels and it's aging, and you want to maximize that. You want every barrel you empty and put in a bottle, you want to get so I certainly don't blame them for trying. I think they just botched this attempt. But yeah, I think in the long run, it's certainly a good product. and will probably support a higher price down the road. And like I say, people do have short memories, and they also don't have a whole lot of alternatives. Every producer has made people mad at some point.
Right.
And if you swear you're never going to patronize them again, your list of available options is going to get smaller and smaller. And I think people who decided they were going to abandon all of the majors and start patronizing the micro distilleries, I don't think they've exactly been edified with that option either, because this stuff's not quite up to the standard of the major producers yet, most of it.
I agree too. So I think we beat up on Beam enough. What do you think?
Oh yeah.
All right. So
there's always more, but I'm usually beating up on Diageo. So beating up on Beam is kind of a nice change of pace for me.
It feels good, right? So I guess let's kind of shift gears a little bit and kind of move over to Sazerac, because you've talked about a few different articles, and we kind of talked a little bit before this, and you've said that they've been doing a lot of things recently. They've been doing a lot of buying. You could almost look at them as like the Apple in this market, that they've got cash reserves sitting around, and you might attribute that to the money the money from the success that they've had of the brand of Fireball. So kind of talk about what you really think about a Fireball being a success, and kind of like what are their purchases that have been happening lately, and what that ultimately means to the industry in itself.
Well, Sazerac, like a couple of other companies, Heaven Hill being the other prime example, is a privately owned company. It's a family-owned company. And because it's privately owned, they don't have to disclose a lot of things that the publicly owned companies like Beam and Diageo do have to disclose. So you have to read the tea leaves a lot with them to try to figure out what they're doing. And while Mark Brown, the president of Sazerac, is generally very open and very accessible, somebody you can get a comment from, talk to, Mark's also, and I always like this about him, if he doesn't want to tell you something, he says, Chuck, I'm not going to tell you that. He doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't obfuscate, try to mislead you. He just says, I'm not going to tell you that. I don't have to tell you that. I'm not going to tell you that. And so a lot of times you have to guess at these things, and they've never connected the dots. But and even Fireball sales are not publicly disclosed, but it's pretty obvious that Fireball is a huge phenomenon. The product itself, it's fine. I mean, it's a big industry. People can drink what they want to drink. It's not my job to tell people what they should drink. I think if people consider themselves whiskey enthusiasts and the main whiskey they drink is Fireball, they might want to do a little self-examination. But
some soul searching, if you will. Yeah.
Again, that's not my business. But from a business standpoint, Fireball's obviously been very successful. It's very profitable because it's very inexpensive to make, and they're selling, tons of it. So it's obviously been a big success for them. And I remember when Heaven Hill struck gold with Hypnotic a few years ago, that funded a lot of things, and they were able to put that money back into the company. And that's what Sazerac has clearly done. They don't have Wall Street, they don't have the market, they don't have shareholders. The company is very closely held. Mark Brown has told me on numerous occasions that he's really got a lot of autonomy to run the company as he sees fit, because basically he has to talk to Bill Goldring a couple times a year. That's the family that owns it. And he says, he talks to Bill a couple times a year, and if Bill's happy with the sales results of the company and the profitability of the company, then Mark can pretty much do what he wants. And so Mark has been in, Sazerac has been investing in a lot of things. They've purchased hundreds of acres of land around the distillery. They have been growing corn on some of it, which they're using, themselves to make bourbon. But they've also been the main reason they bought the land is because they're building warehouses on it, and they're going to, over a 10-year period, probably double the amount of warehouse capacity they have. And as Mark explained, even if their volume sales don't increase, but of course they certainly are, the market wants older and older whiskeys, and so they're obviously if you're going to take something from being 4 years old to 8 years old, it's got to age that much longer, and that means you've got to have more warehouse space to do that. You need twice as much warehouse space to make an 8-year-old whiskey as you do to make a 4-year-old whiskey. So that's a lot of money they've been spending right there that it is not maybe as obvious because they've been doing it sort of over a long term. But they had some warehouses right there by the distillery that had actually been sold 20 years ago, 30 years ago to the state of Kentucky to turn into office buildings. They have since bought those buildings back and converted them back into warehouses. They've built a new state-of-the-art, largely automated warehouse, finished goods warehouse, where the cases of rice. And you have to understand too, Sazerac does a huge business in brands you've never heard of every shape and size, vodkas and gins and liqueurs and imports, rums and so forth. So they have big bottling facilities, big warehouse distribution facilities. They just put a lot of money into the one in Frankfurt and a lot of money into the even bigger one in Owensboro. Then they bought these buildings in New Orleans that they're going to turn into a home place, a Sazerac attraction. The buildings are in a area of downtown where they're on the tourist beat, and so they're going to create something. Actually, it looks quite a bit like their visitor center at Buffalo Trace, what they're planning for the visitor center in New Orleans, and that was a big purchase, and purchasing Southern Comfort and a smaller liqueur brand from Brown-Forman. Southern Comfort is a multi-case brand. That's a brand that's going to certainly increase their multi-million case brand. That's a product that's a big product for them, a big acquisition. It was many millions of dollars to purchase it. And then the most recent thing was buying the distillery in Tennessee. That's a pretty new distillery, and it was built by the folks who own the Popcorn Sutton brand. Excuse me. They did not buy Popcorn Sutton, and they did not buy that brand or any of even the whiskey or distillate that's been produced by that distillery up to this point. They just bought the distillery, but with it they got the staff, and the staff is staying, including the master distiller John Lunn, and so that's very significant. And he was previously at George Dickel, so he certainly knows how to make Tennessee whiskey, knows how to make a whiskey in the same style of as Jack Daniels or George Dickel, and that's what they have announced that they intend to do. So they're just getting started there now. They didn't buy any of the existing liquid, so they're going to be starting distillation now and putting things away, but they'll probably have to build some warehouses because I don't think they have much in the way of warehouse capacity down there. And I know that Sazerac doesn't have any excess warehouse capacity at any of its other facilities. So I'm sure they'll be building warehouses down there, and they're going to start putting away Tennessee whiskey, which in 4 or 5 or 6 years they'll be in a position to bring to the market and bring to the market under the name of Tennessee whiskey. And I don't think the final shoe has dropped. I think Sazerac, again, because of the money they're making off of Fireball and everything else is pretty successful too. I think there are many, many more shoes to drop. So I think you're going to see Sazerac. Again, we don't know how big they are, and we don't know how big they're going to become because they don't have to tell us. But I think they're becoming a much more significant player in the overall industry. They have a couple distilleries in Canada. At least one of them was a distillery that had been shut down that they have reactivated to make Canadian whiskey.
I mean, I guess a good question for you is, I mean, what's the thoughts on just like the point of making more Tennessee whiskey? I think, Jack Daniel's already has a pretty good hold in that market. Is that what they're trying to compete with? Or are they trying to?
Sure. I mean, that's what they're trying to compete with. I mean,
Jack Daniel's Buffalo Trace.
Jack Daniel's sells, internationally and domestically, a total of something like 14, 15 million cases a year, and it's still growing. George Dickel is much smaller. They sell maybe 130, 140,000 cases a year. So they're 1% of Jack Daniel's. So really the Tennessee whiskey category is Jack Daniel's. And I think what you're expressing is the same thing that I wonder, and at least it's a gamble on Sazerac's part. And that's been the other thing about what they've been doing recently. They haven't been afraid to take chances. I think there is a real question mark about whether or not Tennessee whiskey, quote unquote, has legs beyond Jack Daniel's. Is anyone looking for Tennessee whiskey that isn't Jack Daniel's? And it remains to be seen. I think the change in Tennessee law a couple years ago, where Tennessee whiskey now has a legal definition, and I think is helpful in that regard, so that when somebody makes and sells something called Tennessee whiskey, it's not just whiskey made in Tennessee. It's a certain style of whiskey, and it's very close to bourbon. But I think also as American whiskey expands internationally, you maybe go into the United States and it's a tough sell, where everybody knows Jack Daniel's and everybody associates Jack Daniel's with Tennessee whiskey. But imagine that you're in an emerging market where people don't really know these products that well. And sure, they've probably heard of Jack Daniel's, but they don't really understand that Jack Daniel's and Tennessee whiskey are synonymous. And they might be able to be convinced that, hey, there are other Tennessee whiskeys and that Tennessee whiskey is a category. I mean, I suspect that if Sazerac is successful, and there will be other people, there already are, other people trying to do similar things, in that Dickel has been selling some product, some liquid in bulk. They're not marketing these products. They're selling them to other people who are. And they're selling Tennessee bourbon. It's made by Dickel by all the same processes that they use to make Dickel, except for the charcoal filtering. So they're foregoing the charcoal filtering and calling it Tennessee bourbon. So that's one of the things that's been going on. So it's certainly conceivable that in the future, assuming that American whiskey itself continues to be on the upturn, which also is a gamble, but all the indicators are pretty positive, Tennessee whiskey may become a category. I think that it's premature to say Tennessee whiskey is a category, because I don't think there's really any evidence that you can sell Tennessee whiskey that doesn't say Jack Daniel's on it. But that's what we'll see. That's what we'll find out. And that's what they're investing their money in. And we'll see if they're right or not. It'll be an interesting thing to watch.
Okay.
And then one of the interesting things about is everything is kind of long tail. It takes a while for these things to roll out. And Fireball probably is a very limited phenomenon. Does it have another year? Does it have another 2 years? I don't know. But you look at something like Fireball and you think that's probably going to burn itself out, if you'll pardon the pun.
Kind of like how Goldschlager was really big,
or
8 years ago or 10 years ago. Yeah.
And all the companies, every company has placed a gamble on some of this stuff. I mean, there was a time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the micros were all coming out with this white whiskey, and white whiskey seemed to be something that might actually have some legs. And Beam came out with a white whiskey product, and Daniels came out with an unaged product. They didn't necessarily call it white whiskey, but they came out with clear products, unaged products, and it sort of all fizzled out. Nobody's, when was the last time you heard anybody say anything about white whiskey? And you can go back in time. I mean, people were spending big money on. The producers were spending big money on wine coolers back in the late '80s, and that was a thing that got very hot for a while and then fizzled out. Who buys wine coolers anymore?
Never forget.
Yeah, but so these things, and that's part of the industry. That's part of it. Some fads do become permanent products. I mean, Bailey's and the other cream liqueurs maybe seemed like a fad at first, but they've settled into being very successful long-term products. But most of these things don't. And I think Hypnotic is an example of that. I mentioned them before. That was a huge boon to Heaven Hill when it first broke, and it had a 2 or 3 year run, and then it's still sold. There are still people who drink it, but it's not the phenomenon that it was. And I think Fireball's going to go that same way. But you make hay while the sun shines, and they've got this money to invest, and they're investing it. And I think for the most part, again, with my limited ability to judge these things, seem to be investing it wisely. They're not buying golf courses or
they're not diverging from their
they're staying in their comfort zone and building up the business that they're already in. So the other thing that I think maybe it was the next thing you wanted to talk about, and I think it dovetails into what we were just talking about, is the fact of some of these micro distilleries now being acquired either in whole or in part by the bigger companies, and that's a trend I think that we're seeing now, is that the bigger companies want a piece of that action. Sazerac, in a sense, is in that, but they're in it a little differently. They have the distillery in Virginia, the Smith Bowman distillery that they've been now operating as a craft distillery, as a micro distillery. The distillery in Tennessee, even though it's fairly good sized, it is an all pot still operation. So it is certainly has many characteristics of a craft distillery. It's also in a tourism area in the sort of Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge area, and was built to accommodate tourism, and that's a big part of the craft distillery movement. Has been most of the distilleries are very tourism oriented, but Bacardi buying Angel's Envy, and that's instructive right there, because I think if you look at that, and you look at the Old Scout or the Smooth Ambler acquisition, and not acquisition but investment, Luxco buying into Limestone Branch, those kinds of things what the big companies seem to be buying is not so much production facilities as brands. All the companies that have had these deals, that have done these deals, have been companies that have one or more strong brands. And so High West, had their, High West is a distillery, and recently enlarged expanded their distillery. But what everybody knows about High West is the products they didn't distill, like the Burr Rye and the Midsummer Night's Dram and those things that are products that they acquired and did a good business with, successful business with, and that's what the majors are acquiring. So if you have a small distillery and you want to get acquired, think in terms of brand development. Don't think in terms necessarily of the facility, the production facility, the production aspects of the business, but think in terms of brands and brand marketing, creating brand equity, because that's what the big guys are buying.
Well, maybe me and you should just go buy some barrels from MGP and slap our own labels on it and just become millionaires overnight.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. I mean, that's a good subject because a lot of people think it is that easy, and clearly it's not. I get a lot of people who say, they want to start their own distillery, but they're going to buy some barrels from MGP to get started. And what I counsel them is that, well, first of all, there aren't a lot of people who've really successfully followed that path, and part of the reason is because there's this perception that you can do exactly what you said: buy some barrels, put some whiskey in bottles, slap some labels on it, make $1 million. And it's not that easy. You find yourself in a business that's not the business you want to be in. You want to be in the business ostensibly of making a product, but you're going to spend all your time selling this product that you didn't make if you want it to be successful, if you even want it to cover the expenses. So I think that's an issue with that pattern. And I think if you actually look at, sort of take a cold hard look at the people who've said that when they started out, most of them are still buying bulk whiskey and selling that primarily. And if they're making anything on their own, they're not selling very much of it and not able to finance that business as well as they thought they were going to, because they're not making money hand over fist with the source product. They may be making a decent profit, but a decent profit's not usually going to be enough to fund the very expensive process of building a distillery, making liquid, putting it in barrels, letting it sit for years. That's the thing that these micro distilleries, most of them, have not found their way clear to do, is the long aging. And they've fooled around with these aging shortcuts, and they've sort of learned the limitations of that. And it's hard. It's very expensive to finance aging inventory. You might say, well, you only have to do it once, because once you've filled that pipeline and you get past that fifth year or whatever, then you're drawing whiskey out as much as you're putting whiskey in. But if you're successful, you have to keep putting more whiskey in every year, and that costs a lot. And the industry, really, for its whole history, has seen that, where sometimes success can be as dangerous, as hazardous as failure, because you need money to finance growth, and there's just not enough of it in your own pockets, or you find yourself putting all of your assets into the business and don't have anything to take home, don't have anything to diversify with. It's tough. It's a tough business, and sometimes success can be just as challenging as failure. It's sort of like the old joke of, you know how to make a small fortune in the whiskey business? Start with a large fortune.
There you go. Not only that, as I think here in the next few years, you're going to be seeing probably a big crowded market too. So that's you're gonna be fighting for shelf space in the next few years at the same exact time.
Yeah, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, the bubble's going to burst." I don't know that it is. I don't really see any indications that it's overbuilt. Bourbon is still worldwide, sells about 20% of what Scotch sells. And when you consider that Scotland is a very small country, like 4 million people or something like that, I mean, it's not an independent country, but I mean, still Scotland is Scotland. And, virtually everything they make is export. But that's still what most of the world thinks of as whiskey. I think there's a very good case to be made for bourbon slowly but surely taking away some of Scotch's share. I think certainly the big Scotch producers are scared about that, nervous about that, trying to head it off. So I do think American whiskey, whether it's bourbon or it's Tennessee whiskey or it's rye whiskey, some other style, I think it's going to continue to see very strong growth for really as far as we can see into the future. I don't really expect this to collapse in a couple of years, but at the same time, I've been wrong before. So,
well, good deal. So I guess we're gonna have you on again soon, and we're gonna talk about just more theories and all this other kind of good business stuff. So I want to say, Chuck, thank you again for coming on the podcast today. It was a pleasure to finally get you on here, and this is definitely not gonna be the last time either.
Sure. Well, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
So for anybody that does want to get in contact with you, how would they want to do, or how should they do that?
I'm on Facebook. I'm not too hard to find there. I luckily have a pretty unusual last name, Cowdery. So pretty much Google Cowdery, and you're going to find me and one of the founders of the Mormon Church. I am not one of the founders of the Mormon Church. So don't follow those links. Follow the ones that go to Chuck Cowdery, and you'll find me pretty easily. The blog is called the Chuck Cowdery blog. That's the easiest way to enter into the world of Chuck Cowdery, and that's pretty easy to find.
And make sure you support Bourbon Pursuit on Patreon if you like what you hear. That's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. Also follow us on all those social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter @Bourbon Pursuit. And if you have any more show suggestions or anybody you'd like to hear or talk and come on the show, make sure you send us an email. It's the duo, THEDUO @bourbonpursuit.com. And with that's it, we're going to wrap it up, and we will see you all next week. This podcast of Bourbon Pursuit is in partnership with thewhiskeywash.com, a lifestyle website for news and reviews for people who like whiskey, and for those who think a life without whiskey has no style, thewhiskeywash.com.